Benson Caricature, call line, +2547022600128. Kenya. The 10th of June, 2022. Distinguished Citizen, the Republic of Kenya, Direct Media, Kenya. Dear ladies and gentlemen, neglected issues. I write to you seeking your attention, criticism and appraisals. You might opt to deliberate on the following, which might be of great significance in our day-to-day life. They might include politics, government policies, the Constitution, education, the government, voters' opinions, political beliefs, political impressions, election poll, valid votes and election integrity and their correlation with the economy, stability and security. In all the above, I might try to pinpoint loopholes in our system, give illustrations, suggesting likely remedies and defend my point of view. I might with pleasure dedicate this letter to Sister Vivian Zola, our intelligentsia, Microsoft community, Janet R.D., my fond memories of my late political African heroes, Dr. John Pombe Magufuli and Nelson Mandela, may their fighter souls rest in eternal peace, John Ngugi, Mafia and all selfless people. These great individuals and group might have stimulated my recent avid reading and writing spirit. I might have been previously perceived a retarded student while still in school. Now I might have known better about my wasted time, aptitudes, abilities and glory. They might also have enlightened me to source true joy and satisfaction only from books, intellectual company and true knowledge. All network providers and the media ought never to abuse their offices by participating in illegal tracking and censoring dissenting voices in their platforms. All Kenyans might be entitled to free speech, provided they respect the rule of law. I might try my best to uphold the rule of law in this letter. Above all, you ought only to concentrate on the general ideas in this letter, disregarding the grammar, unintended intemperance or unrealized ignorance. I might apologize, in advance, to those who might honestly and objectively get offended. These might be on either textual or contextual harms. Politics. These might be strategic affairs of the state and those aspiring to govern, public institutions, winning public opinions, which includes beliefs, impressions or knowledge. These parties might endeavor to form, sustain and preserve the government. They might only obtain or maintain power through elections. Most of us might have been politicians, because we might have taken part in political processes, in one way or another. These might include vying for seats, voting for candidates, campaigning for issues, conducting elections, contributing to political issues and participating in making and voting political policies. Politics might be part and parcel of our daily life. Politics also ought to make our local and global living standards better. The registrar of our local political parties ought to only admit and register independent political parties. These parties ought only to be owned by all individual members, never sole political enterprises. They also ought to represent clear ideologies, documented and published on their websites, and deposit a copy to the registrar. They also ought to have clear policies on funding and membership. They ought to desist issuing unrealistic charming manifestos when they only seek votes. Citizens and members ought to contest any breach by the party to the registrar. The registrar too ought to be beyond reproach. This is to save the nation from being forced to honor selfish party obligations from private political campaign investments deals. These silent deals might continue to loot our country in later governments. Government policies. These might be guidelines that might be considered while running the nation. They might be either publicized or classified. They might be prudently crafted by interested parties or their professional agents. They might stipulate clear course of actions, setting clear guidelines for executing present and future decisions. This might be either in drafting laws or taking actions. They might be drafted, basing on material and non-material interests. These interests might be for local and foreign parties, to guarantee economic stability, security, continuity and growth. Their interests might be majored on national growth in terms of gross domestic product, taxation, trade, production, contracts, protectionism, ease of doing specific businesses, tariffs, historical justice, exchange in liquidities and securities, national and global security. To a small extent, they might address economic development and the happiness index of the citizens. They might be mostly give-take documents. The Constitution. This might be the basic principle on all legally binding laws of a country. It might determine the powers and duties of the government and guarantees certain rights to the citizens. It might be likely an example of a public policy document. This document might set guidelines on which present and future drafting of laws in the country ought to strictly observe. Some experts and parties, who prepared previous constitutions, might be lamenting about the current. Some who prepared the current one might be rejoicing. Some who might prepare those later versions might rejoice then. Interests might change or masters and partners might go. All constitutions might be mostly subjective because most rational constitutional expertise might be subjective too. The process might invite questionable public participation. Minimum public education might be provided on how most citizens might submit their views. Sometimes the opinions might be collected within limited time ultimatums. All citizens might never be well educated on the proposed copy, before being subjected to voting. In most cases elaborate and simplified report on the deliberations might never be published. The proposed document might be finally presented to electorate for voting. If voted, it might be promulgated. Sometimes the voting process might be conducted amid questionable election integrity. Some voters might be bribed, lured, conned or tricked to vote. It might be heartbreaking, that majority of us might hardly differentiate between the Constitution and law. Education. This might be a field of study that deals mainly with the teaching and learning in schools or learning setups, both formal and informal. A progressive education ought to empower students to solve new and emerging problems. These techniques applied ought never necessarily, previously taught. Students might just be applying their concepts. A retrogressive education might emphasize on memorizing contents while never understanding the concepts. Learning a concept ought to meet all criteria which ought to be satisfied in defining the contained words, syllogism. Some of the content memorized might be on outdated issues and technologies, rote learning. Our brains might never attain the memory capacities, processing speed, concentration, efficiency and reliability of machines. We might be better than artificial intelligence, in machines, in terms of fast adjustment to new environments, solving new challenges. Innocent students ought never to be cultured, to revise the memorized contents just only for an exam. They might forget the contents afterwards and wait for the next exam. They ought to learn concepts, which might never be forgotten. Riding a bicycle might be a simple example of a skill learned that might never be forgotten. The life of an individual might be a continuous examination, time for revisions might never be granted. Education ought to make life better. This might be through innovating or inventing technologies for solving emerging local and global problems. Certification might never be all dependable. Once a talented apprenticed individual demonstrates and proves the ability to conduct specific job assignment, they ought to be contracted. These ignored and overshadowed individuals ought to open websites to advertise their exceptional talents and abilities. This might reduce redundancy and duplications in our payrolls. It might also increase productivity, returns on investments and reduce costs in retraining employees while still paying their contracts. Moreover, it might improve work efficiencies in our companies, organizations, institutions, businesses, homes and government. We might have to transit from some of our protective employment culture to performance contracts. Homeschooling might have to be encouraged in the near future. This might demand willing and able parents, who might afford to hire specialists to identify the aptitudes and abilities, then recommend appropriately. All students might have special abilities and aptitudes. Play and socialization among students might also be encouraged. Work without play makes Jack a dull boy. True wisdom might know that we know nothing. We ought to systematic doubt and question issues to elicit clear expression of truth. This might encourage us to listen, observe and learn more. Learning might never end and our last lesson might be during death. Most first world citizens might be very adventurous. They might never fear to fail while trying. Instead they mostly learn from their mistakes. They might never cease conducting individual and group research. Their government in conjunction with philanthropic organizations provide them enabling environment and support. This might be what their teamwork, division of labor and specialization might have brought to their countries. This teamwork might be the main reason why they might be fast in technological advancements. They might be already in nanotechnologies, as we speak. We might be obsessed with mean mentalities. Most of us might be lacking authentic philanthropic spirits. We might only be willing to dish out political handouts. We might also be generous in regularly submitting religious offerings and sacrifices, with reservations mostly for hoped divine interventions in our only self-security, prosperity and happiness. We ought to refrain from playing some bribing games on divine matters. It might be beyond our human comprehension. Giving and never expecting to receive back might be genuine. We might have just to look at some of the deplorable conditions of our immediate neighbors to ascertain if we might be truly generous. Ironically, we might be celebrating having more than 3,116 disguised billionaires, worth in Kenyan shillings. These data might be from lifestyle audits on the individuals and some of their suspected proxies. What about if we might dissect all our bank statements and hidden transactions? Their identity ought never to be booed because they might have never been convicted on the same. We ought never to rely only on foreign donors to solve our local financial challenges. Charity ought to begin at home. We ought to demonstrate our almost 6 decades independence by funding our own local non-governmental organizations and projects. Our education might have been manufacturing human robots. The victims might be destined to politically and economically serve the perceived invisible and the invincible. Let the sleeping dog lie, forgetting they are the ones who made the harmless dog sleepy in the first place. This might be why our students find it difficult to be creative, innovative and inventive later in their careers and in their life. Given good mental health, all human beings might have genius spirits at birth. Upbringing and schooling might either cultivate or squeeze them. We ought to teach our students to think critically, because this might be a skill that might be understood. They ought to learn on how to ask and answer relevantly. We ought to keep selfish politics out of our education. Citizen might have to be encouraged to fight a literacy skill, which might have been their quality or state of being able to read and write but might be uninterested to do so. Moreover, all philosophies, for example, ethics, logic, Buddhism, philosophy of logic, atomism, philosophy of history, ideology, philosophy of law, Stoicism, philosophy of mathematics, metaphysics, philosophy of mind, Taoism, philosophical anthropology, aesthetics, philosophy of biology, materialism, philosophy of education, epistemology, philosophy of physics, Confucianism, philosophy of religion, Hinduism, philosophy of science, Shinto, Eleaticism, Jainism, Sikhism, analytic philosophy, Christianity, Indian philosophy, Epicureanism, existentialism, idealism, phenomenology, positivism, pragmatism, Pythagoreanism, rationalism, realism, scholasticism, skepticism, stoicism, utilitarianism, Aristotelianism, Socratic philosophy, empiricism, Cartesianism, Hegelianism, Marxism, Platonism, Judaism, Kantianism and Islamic philosophy. If taught early in life and in a simplified form or in audio-visual forms, then this might introduce critical thinking into our education. Philosophy ought to be taught before technical precepts, other sciences and practical arts. Student ought to collect their own contents during their respective research. Student ought never to only rely on recommended textbooks. This might cultivate passion for learning among students. Real learning ought to be fun and full of joy, just like hobbies. The student might realize on how time elapses owing to high concentration and passion. Teachers might have to retrain on methods to introduce topics, using simple and clear language conversant to all students, deliver topical concepts, debate and vote with student on the preferred topical project, supervise projects and offer advice, admit group and individual projects, adjudicate all project presentation, organize linkages to exchange notes, organize congress and exhibitions to investors and the government, for funding. Students might have to be certified majorly onto their successive projects presented. Student assessments ought never to rely majorly on sit-in examination result, in which exam irregularities might be rampant. This might be what productive education might mean. It might demand concerted effort, government and private funding, time and patience to improve our education. There might be never an excuse never to learn. Also there might be so many learning materials in the internet, electronic libraries. In our local case, it might be also likely that more than 18 million of us own at least one smartphone. All these individuals might cheaply access the internet. We ought to ask ourselves why Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, just to name a few, might have succeeded in many fields of study despite their limitation. During those times, more than 2 millennia ago, learning might have been faced with various challenges. They might also have good faculties for reasoning, knowing how best to question and answer. Some might excuse that they were geniuses. It might also be possible that they had the passion to conduct research amidst their challenges. They might have been excellent students in those academies. The government. She might be either a legitimate or rigged regime. She might be mandated to create, implement and preserve policies. She might manage a nation, in strict accordance to set guidelines, maintaining and creating friends and partners. She might opt to uphold the Constitution or disband it, partially or totally. This might be when she enacts or fail to enact laws and when she enforce or fail to enforce laws. Her priority might be to address competing interests, for her citizens, individual business investors, political investors, the military, local, national and international chambers of commerce and all local and international organizations. Voters' opinions. These might be beliefs, attitudes, views, impressions and knowledge, which we, the electorate, hold on political issues, candidates, political parties and political formations. They might be skewed towards tribal, financial, regional, age, gender, intellectual, racial or religious inclinations. These inclinations might influence our decisions on the ballots. Political beliefs. These might be attitudes, trust and faith which voters hold on candidates, political parties and political formations. Most electorate might vote basing on their intuitive, preconceived judgments. Some might rely on sheer hope, with little or no expectations. Political impressions. These might be mental pictures voters hold about candidates, past and present reputations. In most cases, the images might be misinformed by the media and the propaganda organs. Character assassinations, either slander or libel, might be common in many jurisdictions. We ought to follow the rule of law. We ought to be all considered innocent until proven guilty in our courts, but only after exhausting all legal avenues. We might have to leave all legal judgments to the discretions of our honorable courts. The mandate to judge might be constitutionally reserved to them. This political rumor-mongering culture might have made real news appear fabricated and fabricated ones appear real. Political knowledge. These might be verifiable facts about political issues and parties. Conclusions might demonstrate logical and scientific justifications. It might have to qualify all set criteria in a syllogistic fashion. It might have to demonstrate high information and understanding on various competing issues. Political information deluge might be facilitated both by social and mainstream media. This might be dangerous to our mental hygiene. Too much political data supplied at the same time to an individual might hinder the individual from analyzing and understanding the issues. It might also retard our faculty to reason. It might make us less critical and rational while addressing future challenges. This might be the good reason why we ought to restrict our time on the media. Election poll. These might be the entire political census process. It might involve voting stations, candidates, eligible voters, election period, ballot papers, tallying stations, security preparedness, voting, counting, and declaration policies, analysis tools, technologies employed, network providers, election body, foreign observers, election confidence, challenges encountered, the funds and equipments procured, voters' education, voters' turnout, transmission protocols and the declared results. The entire process might take place before, during and after the voting day. The main objective of the process might be to deliver credible and scientific election results. Valid votes and election integrity. Valid votes might be the correctly marked ballots. A ballot ought to be marked only within the box area. A ballot ought to be marked only for one candidate. On the other hand, election integrity might be the confidence, by the citizens, voters, candidates, foreign observers and the entire global community, in our voting process. This might measure our willingness and ability to deliver credible results. There might be several factors that might determine our election integrity. These might include willingness to do right by all the parties, funds allocated, technologies employed, policies on the process, expertise conducting the process, security preparedness, clarity and openness in the process and independence in the institutions. Votes marking process ought to be conducted in an enclosed booth. These might be to uphold voting secrecy right. Voters campaigning in public rallies might be breaching the same right. All candidates ought to publish their manifestos and biographies and autobiographies on a fair advertising platform, funded by the election body. We ought to stop encouraging these expensive, charming and exhilarated public political rallies. These rallies might be breeding grounds for incitements, radicalization, corruption and violence. They ought to give our voters ample time to evaluate their track records and personalities. Charity might begin at home. Most outstanding leaders might be born and some few might be trained. Leaders might need more wisdom than knowledge to run local or international affairs. Blank and spoiled ballots ought to be rejected. Votes ought to be deposited into the appropriate boxes. Those votes deposited on wrong boxes ought to be rejected too. This might be because counting in the corresponding boxes might have been finalized and signed. Officers ought to guide and direct voters to deposit their votes into the appropriate boxes. Voting and counting ought to be finalized during daylight. The election body ought to rehearse on their preparations or readiness a day prior to the voting day, in every voting station. Voters ought to be given ultimatum to be on the voting queues on that voting day. Maybe latest at 9 o'clock in the morning might be ideal. Agents too ought to report early to the station for inspections and receive directions. Perhaps 6 o'clock in the morning. If voting might start at exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, then voting might end latest at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The entire process might be finalized latest at 4 o'clock in the evening. This might only be possible given peace and tranquility, high voting efficiency and the willingness to make the process a success by all the parties in the process. All voters ought to queue. Exceptions ought to be given only to those in health emergencies or serious physical incapacities. We ought never to give VIP treatments to politicians and respectable members in society. We might be all ladies and gentlemen with patience and who respect all other voters. Some might excuse that voters might be bribed by candidates while on the queue. It might also be factual that all ladies and gentlemen might be beyond reproach. The election body ought to only admit volunteering agents to witness the process. These individuals ought to be people with honor and beyond reproach. Some decent scholars and some spotless members of the clergy might be best for these assignments. They ought to apply only on pro bono consideration to the respective candidates. These individuals, if successful, ought to be nominated, then honored with various local and international awards for their patriotic and ethical work in protecting and preserving the human suffrage. Their work might also be to enfranchise all voters. After selection, the candidate ought to notify all the successful agents, and then submit those data to the election body. 3 copies of their fingerprints, signatures, contacts, station of choice and ID details ought to be part of the data. These data ought to be coded into the main server. All agents might be demanded to officially identify themselves to the returning officer early on the voting day. The returning officer ought to have a copy of their identity, for corroboration. Moreover, it might prove difficult for all the volunteering agents to collude. These agents might be beyond reproach. Also, most of these agents might never have been acquaintances, partners or friends. All this might be because most candidates might never afford to hire all agents. Secondly, we ought to rebuild our soiled election integrity. If we never chip in to freely assist our poor candidates, then they might be forced to source funding for the same. This might be where wealthy political investors might chip in to lend funds for campaigns. All boxes ought to be emptied, then sealed before casting is started. Agents ought to take photos of the unique QR codes on the initial seals. After voting is finalized, the seals ought to be inspected once again. The boxes might then be opened. Votes might be tallied and recorded. During counting, officers who might touch votes ought never to be allowed to access a pen. This might be used maliciously to spoil votes. The returning officer ought to be the only mandated officer to record the results on the document and finally sending the signed document to the main server, using a simple smartphone. Each document ought to have its own QR code. Agents ought to take a photo of the document after they have signed. They might use recommended ink in signing the documents. Agents might use that copy to compare to the triple copy, which might be sent back by the entire triple server simultaneously. The original document, all counted votes and all broken seals ought to be deposited back into the box. The hole into the box ought to be sealed too. Agents might take their final photo of that seal. Agents ought to concentrate only on their assigned mandate to reduce overcrowding and confusions in the station. A single ballot box ought to be processed at a time, from opening, counting, recording, sealing back and signing. Other agents for other respective seats ought to wait for their turn outside, as one box might be processed at a time. It might be safer and prudent to start processing the box representing the least seat, in an ascending order. In this manner, it might be likely that concentration, patience and liveliness in the process might be maintained. Most of us might be eagerly waiting for the results, in the box representing the top seat. Agents ought to leave the station after they have finalized their mandate, to create room for counting the next box. Voters too ought to leave after they have deposited their votes. Assigned officers might have to organize the logistics of the sealed boxes to safe custody. The documents ought to be filled or signed only on their respective empty spaces. These blank spaces might be on respective candidates' result followed by their agent's fingerprint signature and respective returning officer's fingerprint signature at the bottom. The entire triple server ought only to accept documents from respective returning officers' contacts. The data of all the returning officers, in their respective stations ought to have been coded on the entire triple server prior. The entire triple server ought to validate a threshold of half the expected accurate fingerprint signatures of agents in the document. Also, the entire triple server ought to validate the QR code on the document. The entire triple server ought to prefer the document with the highest number of accurate fingerprint signatures. The entire triple server also ought to accept documents only from their respective voting stations' geolocations. The entire triple server ought to reject duplicated documents copies. The entire triple server also ought to open and start admitting documents only within the set time parameters, beyond which it ought to close. Time parameters may be from 1 o'clock in the afternoon to 5 o'clock in the evening might be ideal for the entire triple server to admit documents. Above all, the returning officer's fingerprint signature ought to be mandatory for validation. The entire triple server also ought to send back a copy of the received document, as a receipt to vouch the process, to the agents, the candidate and the returning officer, once the document might be processed. Agents ought to leave only when at least half have received notification from the entire triple server. Those who might never have received the notification might request a forwarded copy from the returning officer. The entire triple server ought to list the stations almost delaying to submit their documents, basing on the closing ultimatum. The entire triple server ought also to list the rejected documents from respective stations. Officers on the entire triple servers but far apart stations, monitoring the similar processing, ought to make quick follow-up on those stations and those rejected documents. In case a document might be rejected based on faulty fingerprint signatures, then the specific signatures ought to be resigned in the adjacent spaces. In case of wrong geolocation, the document ought to be resent on the correct geolocation, as directed by the experts managing the entire triple server. The original document ought to be deposited to the box only when some signatories have received notifications from the entire triple server. Each political party ought to nominate one agent, who might also receive all the results for the party, from the entire triple server. The entire triple server ought to send triple final results simultaneously to all candidates and even to all citizens, as soon as the last document might be processed. Citizens' contact databases might be sourced from local network providers, then coded on the entire triple server. The entire triple server's algorithm and language ought to be watertight and beyond users' manipulations. The entire triple server ought to synchronize their clock and database. If one server might malfunction, then the other twin server might continue executing the same mandate. The entire triple server ought to only be editable a month before any general or by-election. The process of the synchronized editing of the algorithm of the entire triple server ought only to last for only 2 weeks. The entire triple server ought to process data at the highest efficiency, time synchronization, security and reliability. If widespread number of the agents, candidates and citizens might fail to receive any notifications, then this might indicate a total malfunction in the system. This might likely be a maliciously instigated scheme, by the expertise running the system or system administrators or the network providers or the power provider, or any collusion within. The location of the entire triple server ought to be classified for security purpose. Cloud technologies might also be employed. The system ought to have 3 independent administrators periodically changing passwords. The election body, system developer and the internal security ought to have guaranteed the security of the entire process, its software, hardware and expertise. Citizens and candidates might have moral and legal grounds to contest the outcomes in the designated election courts. There might be several reputable and affordable companies which might be dependable if procured to deliver, install, train and maintain these technologies. This might build high voting efficiency and reliability. It might above all, rebuild our contaminated election integrity. Those who might plan to disrupt the process ought to be met with proportionate force. Some parties might be evil and malicious, for certain ill interests. Transmitting results in raw numbers might lack credibility and security. This might be another loophole for rigging votes. All network providers ought to demonstrate high professional code of conduct. They ought to invest in their security, backup for backup. They ought to guarantee excellent network connectivity. This might be a sensitive part in fast delivering credible results. System failures might delay the voting process. Officers ought to be trained to use the gadgets, inspect them and fix malfunctions. Our identity card numbers ought to be added into our biometric databases, as user passwords. This might be to substitute our fingerprints, in case of unsuccessful login, due to damaged fingerprints. This might be to prevent officers from searching in the manual databases, which might be time-consuming. Our registered voters ought to confirm if they might be in the voting databases, prior to the voting day. This might reduce confusions, on the voting day. Ballot counting ought to be conducted only at the voting stations and during daylight. This ought to be done in the presence of all agents. Casted blank ballots might be converted to be valid votes during counting where agents might be absent. Even the remaining ballots after all voters have voted, might be marked to the advantage of the dominant candidates. This might be through confusions, compulsion and threats. This might be another reason why some prefer to delay voting efficiency in anticipation for the games to be played at night. In other stations, votes for opponents might be spoiled deliberately, to favor the dominant. These might be the reason we always register excellent voting turnouts. Most of our voters' opinions might never count in our election poll, given our current election integrity and technology. Listing candidates on the ballot papers ought to be on alphabetical order. All aspirants ought to be considered equal, hence treated fairly. They might represent our dreamed visions. These leaders might also engineer real prosperity to our nation. Delays in the voting process might create suspicion, tension or even violence. The nation and the rest of the world ought to follow the briefings on the media. Victors might arrange to collect their certifications. How our KCPE mathematics, social science and science papers might have been marked, might have been a clear and simple example of efficiency and accuracy in our technology. We ought to upgrade our election technologies to those heights. Delay in counting presidential votes might have been facilitated when returning officers might have been directed to deliver documents to the centralized manual tally station. We might never know what might have happened to those documents on the way. These proposed technologies might never be too expensive to afford. It might cost less than 2 billion Kenyan shillings. This might be only possible if local network providers might volunteer citizens' contact data to the election body. Once installed, it might save the country these enormous election budgets to facilitate every general and by-elections. It might save poor taxpayers toiled money. Our retrogressive elections technologies might never be too difficult to improve, given goodwill for the country. Candidates ought to organize home tally centers. This might be facilitated by the received results from their agents and the entire triple server. We might all be confident in our election integrity and accept all results. The judiciary ought to be the only custodian of votes. This might reduce time taken to close election cases. Ballot boxes' evidences might be already in court's custody. Some petty election cases might never be admitted by the courts, for never meeting certain threshold of evidence required. We ought to protect our institutions. Their mandates might be very complicated and demanding. Some institutions might be lacking independence in their funding, their appointment and dismissals, their continuity or even their powers to execute functions. Some institutions might be legally divided into several sister co-institutions, just to curtail all of them from executing certain functions touching the invincible and invisible. Justice might be relative in our country. We ought to end these petty blame games against our innocent institutions. Their failures might be by design. The sovereignty belongs to the people of Kenya. Our election body and legislators ought to set realistic bottlenecks for interested aspirants to meet. They ought never to favor only the wealthy aspirants. Some aspirants might even buy their academic credentials. Some might buy their ethical approvals. Some might even forge the credential of the voters who nominate them. Some might bitterly withdraw their ambitious and realistic aspirations for our nation. This might also be the reason why poor and popular aspirants seek huge debts to fund their campaigns, from political investors. These investors might never be philanthropic individuals. They might demand profited paybacks for their investments. Scratch my back, I scratch yours too. This might be another reason why most leaders might frequently fail to deliver on their manifestos once elected to their offices. We ought to question our expensive campaigns. Some of these campaigns might run on a budget of approximately 7 billion Kenyan shillings. Whereas if elected, the leader might only earn approximately 300 million Kenyan shillings from the state coffers in their 5 years mandates. Then where might the remainder come from? All those generous leaders ought to declare their interest behind their generosities. Some of them might be genuine patriotic philanthropists. The truth might never be that shallow. Somebody somewhere might have hypnotized our nation, long ago. There might be 4 figurative explanations to this. Either blind leaders might be misleading many blind citizens, or sighted leaders might be misleading many blind citizens, or many blind citizens might be unaware that their taxes might be the main revenue to the government and the sovereignty belonging to them, or many sighted citizens might be fearing government persecuting or prosecuting force on dissents. We ought never to fear mortals. These perceived invincible and invisible might be very vulnerable in life. Some of them might be struggling with health, perception, spiritual, ethical or mental issues. Materialism might be their only aspirations, never patriotism. We ought to be vigilant and vocal on how our public resources ought to be managed by our leaders and officers. Our country might be very important than all of us, because she is immortal. The mainstream media ought to be vocal on these ills. They might be commanding huge followings than most of us. They ought never to only profit from political and commercial advertisements, and entertaining frustrated citizens. They ought to educate the nation. They ought also to invite distinguished scholars to educate the nation. These learned fellows might inspire knowledge to our young generation, who might be our only salvation. They ought to desist inviting only political scientists, selfish politicians, propagandists and questionable analysts. Most of these individuals might only support their interests. We ought never to fool the nation with unrealistic hopes. We might need the truth to heal. For example, we might need a clear and elaborate strategy on how we might service our huge foreign debts, approximately 9 trillion Kenyan shillings. We might also need a clear map on how we intend to boost productivity in all sectors of the economy to match our debts. We might also need a step-by-step method on how we might reduce our wealth gap ratio. We might also need a clear education that might make most of us critical and rational. We might also need a clear way to rebuild our almost lost patriotism. We might also need a clear and realistic way on how we might break our tribal divides and make our nation united, just like how we might have been before being enslaved or colonized. Some tribes might be currently perceived better than others. Some of these perceptions might consider some citizens better than others. We might also need governments for all citizens, never offices for political friends and partners. We might all be paying certain taxes. I might be never a distinguished scholar. I might only be a young Kenyan observer, with little formal education. I might have been so concerned and ashamed of the numerous loopholes that might have been ignored in our country. The truth might set our conscience free. We might be never wild animals with little conscience. If we might all decide to be silent on these issues, sooner or later, we might explode. This might never be a prophecy of doom. Peace might be only sustainable when most citizens might be contented. We ought to find a way to narrow the economic gap between the super-rich and the poor. This might reduce the number of those angry and bitter on our system for neglect. The words of the late J.M. Karayuki, may his soul rest in eternal peace, might still be alive today. 10 millionaires surrounded by 10 million beggars. If he might have been alive today, then he might have said, 3,116 billionaires surrounded by 32 million beggars. The number of the super wealthy might have increased to approximately 312,000%, while the number of the poor might have tripled. This might be the reason why our per capita national debt might be currently standing at approximately 250,000 Kenyan shillings. We ought to improve the welfare of these dependent and insecure citizens as we strive to own these huge assets. This ratio, as it might currently stand, might never guarantee national or international security. These big lots might only be working for basic needs, not even comforts. They might be toiling for only less than 2,000 Kenyan shillings per week. If we might judge contextually, then most of these lots might be innocent for accepting those political bribes. They might include small artisan traders, subsistent farmers, casual laborers and all those underemployed. The world might never be safe until the plights of this lot might be addressed. This might be the reason we experience endless terrorism across the globe. Also, this might be another reason why our jails might never be filled, regardless of our severe punishments for crimes. Their animosities might only be addressed candidly on the table. Our country might need benevolent, bold and patriotic and sometime tough leaders. These leaders ought to never be overshadowed or predicted by the perceived invincible and invisible. They ought to set the right precedents for other leaders and citizens to follow. They ought to expect a tough fight ahead, clearing these monkey businesses deep-rooted in our dear and only motherland. These individuals hindering our progress might be both local and international business partners. The perceived invisible and invisible might never relinquish power at will. They might give a fight to retain their control. They might fight back either by using loopholes in our legal system or through propaganda and misinformation in the media. Some of them might even be lethal, willing and able to eliminate all their living obstacles. All of them ought to be met with proportionate force. On our behalf, these pioneering leaders ought to find a way to cut these shackles of foreign dependency, beggar spirit. We ought to only emulate the valor, patriotism, selflessness and heroism in our celebrated and uncelebrated leaders. These genuine leaders might have inspired my true love for my country. We all ought to always remember that our country ought to be perpetual. Muammar al-Gaddafi might have obtained a long bloody reputation on the global stage, but we ought to listen and study his speech in 2009, addressing the United Nations, as chair of the African Union, to judge his defense. We also might have to compare the post-Gaddafi prosperity and stability of Libya, a decade after he might have been killed in 2011 by probable instigated local rebels. Also, Vladimir Putin might appear to be very heartless today. But we might also need to remember how he fought the oligarchs in Russia and opposed those who abandoned the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty, early in his presidency. He might have also supported fighting terrorism after the 11th of September attacks. Human truth and justice might be always relative. The world ought to candidly sit down in a table, forgive the past and find a respectable way forward. Global peace and tranquility might only be possible if we all might swallow our prides and agree to dialogue with our adversaries. We might never afford to sacrifice millions of innocent lives just for our selfish political, military, social or economic interests. The international military complexes and their arms races might be our only big problem. Egalitarianism and selfishness might be another problem meeting our peace. Repeating the same diplomatic mistakes might destabilize the whole world. If we never respond quickly, then we might sacrifice all living things from the face of this world. We ought to remember that we might be already in nuclear era. A single nation might deter a global united front fighting her. The UN, EU, WTO, NATO, AU or any other powerful multinational organizations and individuals ought never to be abused to disrespect the sovereignty of other nations. Some of these bodies might push for certain subjective and protective directives just to curtail their perceived enemy nations, individuals or organizations. Some powerful individuals, organizations, nations and the media might be taking advantage of our ignorance and naivety, to divide then rule us. I might mostly be empathetic and angry for those innocent deaths and sufferings in war-torn countries, and all over the globe, owing to petty interests of influence. I might also be sympathetic to those good innocent soldiers dying or wounded or suffering for never well-informed cause. Some might only be taking commands from their seniors, without being given space to object. All parties fighting might be blamed. Some provoked the war, some overreacted. Sometimes we might excuse some overreaction for self-territorial defense. Our sounded generals also ought to demonstrate their wisdom in military planning and strategies. They ought to realize that their directives might have long-term global consequences. They ought sometimes to question some ill-calculated commands by their commander-in-chiefs. We might even have to overhaul some outdated military curricula and command structures. Nations might only be safe if they make genuine friendship with all their perceived weak or strong enemies. The innocent or poor people might be the one hardly affected by the ripples effects of global diplomatic tensions and destabilizations. We might have to look at the current global migration crisis, owing to destabilizations. We ought to have a united or individual front to rally for global peace and integration. Remember, isolating nations economically and socially might always be counterproductive. Those nations might have their own unique ways of life. Leave them at peace. We ought to celebrate our global diversity and respect each other. We might need all nations for trade and socializations. No single nation might be totally self-reliant. This might have been evident in how the COVID-19 pandemic might have been approached. Back to our local issues, we ought to pay our due taxes. Some might be hiding their income and wealth. Some might file false returns to our tax collector. Some might be unaware that we ought to file tax returns. Some might be unwilling to pay taxes because they might mistrust the government poor management on public resources. Some might even hide wealth in offshore accounts, in tax havens. Some even might invest abroad where there might be high returns and reasonable taxes. Some wealthy ones might only transact and own properties mostly through many small proxies, who are heavily rewarded. We ought to shame all evaders and those countries supporting and facilitating these malpractices. It might never be rocket science. We ought just to do lifestyle audit on properties owned by individual and by their proxy to calculate the tax due. We ought to try a progressive tax system in our country. The tax collector too might be blamed. They might be having a weak system, allowing these individuals to evade. They might also be providing minimum education to the public on taxation issues. We ought to prevent overtaxing only poor citizens. It might prove counterproductive because their small businesses might shut within a short trading period. Most of them might have been listed already in our local credit rating bureau, CRB. Their initial capitals might have been financed through loans, which they might have failed to service. This might be facilitated by little business managerial training offered, economic recessions and stagnations or high interest rates on loans. The poor mostly might find it difficult to secure future cheap loans. Lenders might opt to lend mostly to the rich at lower and negotiable rates, because of their huge collateral securities. We ought to enact laws to facilitate the freezing of all the wealth owned by economic crime convicts. These crimes might include fraud, embezzlement, grabbing of public assets, money laundering and tax evasion. This might eradicate our public stealing culture and rebuild national prosperity. It might prove difficult to differentiate between earned and looted wealth. Together with unclaimed assets, the government might service most of her loan obligations and run on austerity. She might only look for foreign markets for our goods and services, to those nations who might welcome us. She also might have to improve our technologies in production in the areas that we might have global comparative advantages. Good morals and ethics ought to be taught, encouraged, motivated, trained, demonstrated, preached, emulated or cultured. This ought to be incorporated into our belief system. Good upbringing and good schooling might be how ladies and gentlemen are tuned. Laws and bylaws might come and go. This might depend on the available constitution. We ought never to abuse our global legislative privileges in enacting laws to govern all good manners. This might be a waste of our legislative time because these laws might be broken at will, by all those who believe they might have been sidelined by those subjective laws. The 1st of June to the 6th of June, 2022, our intelligentsia, our identity requested to remain masked, did volunteer to conduct an electronic sample survey across our country. Several Kenyan adults responded to our inquisition. Our members' views were excluded from the survey. The poll might have cost only 6,500 Kenyan shillings, self-funded. The questionnaires might have been written in one of the local languages and posted to specific WhatsApp groups. This might have been motivated by the system's relentless and mostly unfair editorial censorships. Conducting a conventional survey might be a very expensive venture, costing millions of Kenyan shillings. Moreover, we might already be having powerful cartels in the field refereeing the games. We might be considered insignificant. Nonetheless, we might have managed to test the following 4 hypotheses. 1. Kenyan voters on August general election 2022 might vote basing on beliefs and impressions. 1,350 responded yes. 150 responded nay. 429 responded any. 2. Kenyan voters on August general election 2022 might vote basing on facts. 48 responded yes. 1,152 responded nay. 336 responded any. 3. Kenyan voters on August general election 2022 might report to vote. 1,091 responded yes. 246 responded nay. 59 responded any. 4. Kenyan voters on August general elections 2022 might accept the outcomes. 507 responded yes. 367 responded nay. 704 responded any. The conclusions might have been the following. 1. 90% agreed that Kenyan voters might vote on August general election 2022, basing on beliefs and impressions. This might have qualified the first assumption. 2. 4% agreed that Kenyan voters might vote on August general election 2022, basing on facts. This might have disqualified the second assumption. 3. 82% agreed that Kenyan voters, on August general election 2022, might report to vote. This might have qualified the third assumption. 4. 58% agreed that Kenyan voters, on August general elections 2022, might accept the outcomes. This might have qualified the fourth assumption. Basing on these raw findings, it might be 90% likely that Kenyan voters might vote basing on beliefs and impressions, 82% likely that they might report to vote, and 58% likely that they might accept the outcomes. If this survey might represent our actual voting trends, only 58% accepting the outcomes and only 4% voting on facts, then this might be undesirable for our future national security and prosperity. We might have opted never to subject those data to detailed analysis, at specific confidence, because responses concerning political issues might be fluid or might fluctuate at a high rate. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we ought to debate and educate ourselves on our political, economic and security issues. This might motivate us to secure and preserve our integrity, human suffrage, dignity, democracy, patriotism, constitution, stability, nation, security, and above all, earning us a befitting respect on the global stage. We ought never to be cowed, because our love for our country might be stronger than the challenges we might experience. We might also be people with valor, patriotism and full of adventure. We ought never to allow these dealers to steal our future. We ought to build independent institutions that might uncover, arrest, prosecute and convict these shadow and powerful criminals and nationalizing all their wealth. Whatever the consequences and time, we might all lack something to lose for these causes, in the long run. We ought to maintain peace, during this period of elections. We ought never to be incited to fight our own local citizens, owing just to their tribes. Some leaders might have continually divided us, since our independence, into these tribal mentalities and clusters to rule us. They might be only interested in galvanizing our tribal support to always vote them into political offices. Also, we ought to shift a bit towards rational political judgments. We might have to refrain from all political animosities, propaganda, hysteria and euphoria. These elections and leaders might come and go. We ought to be always sober, in order to vote wisely and critically. We ought to never burn our country, owing to ignorance, because most of us might lack dual citizenships. Moreover, after burning we might come back to pick the ashes. We might have all suffered previous election violence, in one way or another, we might need never to forget those ugly experiences and repeat those mistakes. It might also be true that we might never sustain any civil war for a month, because most of us might starve or might fail to defend our life or might be internally displaced or might become refugees. Most of these invisibles and invincible might have dual nationalities and some might have foreign investments already. They might never be refugees. You ought to scrutinize these recommendations, make several honest corrections, then rally behind the changes. Our election integrity, tranquility and national prosperity might be all what mostly matter in our local life. We might have to seriously analyze the words in our national anthem, never just singing them in choruses. We might have to use our human suffrage as the tool to defend our rights, respect, freedoms, dignity, peace, prosperity and sovereignty. If voters might evaluate that our current voting technology and integrity might disenfranchise them, then they might respect and honor their conscience by absconding going to vote or by spoiling the ballots, as their only soft protesting voices. In conclusion, I invite you to join various intelligentsia, share and debate your perspectives. The culture of talking and sharing might enlighten our dear brothers and sisters who might be naive in these complex local and international issues. Above all, I sincerely thank you, all honest, hard-working, resilient, modest, bold, peace-loving and ambitious people, across all divides who might have listened, watched or studied this letter. Yours faithfully, B.K. Benson. APA Style, Neglected Issues. 2022, Ben's Library YouTube/Facebook, Meta. Kenya. Production Notes Studio, Benz. Director, Benson. Producer, Benson. Writer, Benson. Time, 93 minutes. Cast, Janet R.D.